Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. As part of the research for a recent macroanalytics video, I found myself reviewing a number of Matasi macro maps going back well over a decade and a half. It was like looking at a number of jigsaw puzzle pieces. Each piece was part of a particular element of the bigger picture, but without the bigger picture to see where the elements fit, your puzzle becomes frustratingly impossible to piece together. However, going back as far as I did, the bigger picture suddenly began to come into focus. The puzzle pieces began to fall quickly into place. I want to share in this session what I realized and the conclusions I've drawn. As such, I'd like to take you through the subjects I've outlined here. Before I get into some older, dated slides, let's start with some current slides and the harsh reality of what we are facing today. As a society, we've been rapidly adapting to exploding new technologies as we quickly evolve. But is the evolution really advancement? There seems to be a pervasive sense when I talk to people that many feel something is terribly wrong. You're well aware of the explosion in global debt and specifically government debt growth around the world. We have approximately $62 trillion in government debt on a global economy as measured by GDP in 2020 on an approximate $84.96 trillion economy. With the explosion in global government debt reaching $82 trillion in 2022, the GDP is expected to approximate $104 trillion. That is $20 trillion of new debt to grow the global economy by the same $20 trillion. It makes you wonder whether we're growing the economy or just debt. A dollar for dollar. Remember that number, as we'll come back to it later. What we have been witnessing is that every crisis only seems to perpetuate an even higher rate of debt increase. Government spending and deficits are growing geometrically and appear to possibly even going parabolic. If the global economy is only growing based on a dollar-for-dollar basis, what are we really achieving? The answer may be here. In the U.S., the net worth of the top 0.1%, that is 0.1%, equals almost exactly the net worth held by the total of the bottom 50% of the population. What we need to appreciate from the previous slide of this debt growth is that it belongs to all taxpayers equally, irrelevant of wealth or income. The rich are getting much richer, while the poor are, taking it unwittingly in the ear. The taxpayers get the debt and interest load liability, while the rich have their assets appreciated through rising inflation. The poor have few assets that appreciate. In fact, they only really depreciate, while those between the poor and the rich have their primary asset as their home. It comes with a mortgage, property tax payments, utilities, insurance, real estate fees, etc., etc. An expensive investment which over a lifetime, only the base cost appreciates, but by the rate of inflation. Better than renting, but you need shelter. But currently, not the effortless gains that come from appreciating paper investment. The fact is, we clearly have major growing financial disparities in the system. We have increasingly a two-tier system, a system of haves and the have-nots. With the weight of the student loans, housing, cost of living, and shrinking real disposable income, the opportunities to get ahead are diminishing for many. The American dream is disappearing, and many feel trapped by debt and are increasingly being forced to live paycheck to paycheck. Nowhere is that more evident than with the younger generation, millennials and Gen Zs. A recent world report put out by Oxford University in conjunction with Gallup polls addressed global happiness in its 158-page research document. Surprisingly, for the first time ever, the U.S. was not in the top 20. In fact, for those young Americans, age 30 and younger, America ranked as number 62 in their happiness. Unhappy 30-year-olds and people in general don't have kids when they don't see a future or a way of supporting them. In the U.S., those aged 30 and younger believe they will be worse off than their parents. The economy is allegedly booming, but only the asset holders have benefit. The young don't have assets, only liabilities. Young adults are more skeptical of government and pessimistic about the future than any living generation before them. They are the most pessimistic generation, in fact, in history. With nearly 72 million millennials and approximately the same number of Gen Zs, they're becoming a major voting force, especially when you consider the 74 million baby boomers are dying off or living on Social Security and Medicare, being paid for by these same young, discouraged, unhappy workers who feel trapped, with generally little hope of realizing the American dream of old. Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Zs may be the first generation in history that are not better off than their parents. Many have given up on the idea they will ever be able to afford a home. They are dominantly stressing over debt. So what is really going on here, and where are we headed? Let's now get to some of the historical charts I mentioned. Because of time, I will start with the time frame since the 2007-2008 financial crisis, when the government debt noticeably really began exploding. As you can see by the copyright at the bottom right, I put this roadmap together in 2012. The y-axis represents the movement from individualism to collectivism, with an overlaying movement from transparency through polarization through restrictive opacity. The x-axis represents the increasing level of complexity from simplicity. This is an overlaying movement from a product markets perspective, from independent to global brands to homogeneous. Our assessment at the time was we were headed towards increasing levels of central control and planning by governments, increasing crony capitalism living off government contracts, financial repression to control rising debt levels, and what could best be described as increasing statism or bigger government. All of this had the potential of leading to governments possibly becoming more totalitarian in their operation. In fact, by 2015, it was becoming so evident that I co-founded the Financial Repression Authority, which still operates today. This chart proved quite prescient, as I wrote about the stages as they unfolded. In 2012, I also put this chart together addressing what I separately saw developing within the area of monetary policy and the potential fallout in the financial markets. I labeled it monetary malpractice with a subcaption of moral malady. The progression of developments I saw unfolding more or less occurred, leaving us with dysfunctional markets resting on malinvestments and operating in a state of delusional valuations. Frankly, it pretty well describes the current situation. During this period, we also witnessed the massive emergence of $1 quadrillion of derivative structures come into existence. The broad complex impacted and to increasing levels began to control all levels of the global financial markets, many with no oversight, over-the-counter, little visibility, and were the primary domain of the largest global banks. We believe this was a perfect recipe for potential banking and financial manipulation, control, and malfeasance. Together, these all led to potential market bubbles, instability, and mismanagement of risk. I've discussed this chart and this chart in previous newsletters, interviews, and videos, all posted on the Matasi website. This chart illustrates that the Magnificent Seven now exercise domination over the markets not seen even during the Nifty 50 era and the dot-com era, both leading to historic market readjustments. What we have seen so far is that we have potentially destabilized the financial markets in an unprecedented fashion. Risk is being systemically mispriced. So far, our discussion has been primarily oriented towards the financial sphere. Let's now consider developments in the area of geopolitics and advancing social change to see if there's any overlap here. The best way to do that might be by looking at the evolution of the Matasi annual thesis papers over the years. We don't just pick an idea each year for our research on a specific subject, but rather have it picked for us through a methodology called the process of abstraction. We track over 40 ever-changing major developments, which we abstract into groups, then synthesize the groups into underlying drivers. From here, we arrive at a particular emerging focus for the annual thesis research efforts. We started publicly publishing our research in 2010 when we focused on the U.S. government's increasing approach to not solving problems, but rather allowing them to become a crisis before taking any action. The approach best described as extend and pretend. Voters during the inevitable crisis were more willing to accept the government's solution, almost any solution for that matter, rather than allowing the crisis to worsen. As Barack Obama's Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, would advise him, never let a crisis go unused, unquote. In the chaos of the crisis, large amounts of money were immediately spent with little disregard to dissenting factions. We also wrote extensively about the sultans of swaps operating behind the $600 trillion global currency and interest swaps. From 2013 through 2016, our papers led us to explore a changing world and issues around increasing globalization, financialization, and mercantilism. From 2017 through 2020, our papers led us towards areas that were fundamentally systemic flaws and how the world's financial system was evolving. The increasing size of debt in the world of fiat currencies was stretching and distorting global regional imbalances to the point of causing increasing global conflict. Of particular note was our work in understanding that global growth, as represented by GDP, or the gross domestic product, was flawed in an era of fiat currencies and trade imbalances being settled in instruments of credit, allowing the growth of unsustainable country debt burdens. Previously, it had to be settled on gold that you had actually bought with wealth. Misrepresentation of inflation through statistical games of hedonics, imputation, substitution, and more were distorting the deflator, so critical to the viability of the usage of GDP. Since then, that distortion and the increasing levels of debt have become so blatant that GDP no longer even approximates the GDI, that is, the gross domestic income. This basic double accounting system requires that total economic expenditures match total economic income. We've reached the point where the financial system has become an illusion for effectively massive wealth transfer. Over the last 4 years, our process of abstraction led us into the areas of the consequences of all these changes and what they appear to be forcing upon us. Social suppression, concern about matters about sustainability, a potential stagflationary debt crisis, the emergence of regulatory states. Social suppression increasingly began taking the form of censorship of ideas that were in conflict with government dictates, mandates, lockdowns, and executive orders. All of these eroding core values and beliefs of personal and economic freedom. Sustainability issues taking the form of climate change and green energy spending initiatives measured in the tens of trillions of dollars globally that must again be borrowed, pushing the debt growth towards an unsustainable parabolic rise. Obviously, there must be a consequence of this, which led us to our 2023 paper on a coming economic stagnation as debt burdens sap economic growth, slowing growth and consequential inflation leading to stagflation, and over the next beta drought decade to an eventual debt crisis. As a consequence, the end of the 40-year Great Moderation has occurred. With it, an era of much higher financial rates, higher market volatility, increased risk premiums for both equities and debt, and inflation surges driven by wage price spirals and increasing shortages of energy and food supplies. To keep the system stable, we are seeing increasing dictates coming from the government as we are forced more and more towards a regulatory state, which we outlined in this year's thesis paper. I'm not going to delve into the key elements driving the regulatory state, like the Cloward-Piven strategy for social engineering, the Chevron doctrine for regulatory control, and more, but leave you to read the supporting developments in this emerging centralized control direction. Instead, I want to go back to this 2012 roadmap I showed earlier. The chart was drawn in 2 dimensions. What has become clearer over time is that it should have been drawn in 3 dimensions, as I show here to the right. The third dimension is dependence, as measured by personal and economic freedoms being given up due to the forces of collectivism and complexity. We are witnessing an ever-increasing encroachment on our personal and economic freedoms. It has taken many forms recently as government mandates, executive orders, funding over $700 billion without congressional spending approvals, which they're responsible for. Broad-based regulatory state regulations coming out of all cabinet areas without congressional approval, and many being forced to the Supreme Court before being found unconstitutional. The most recent being the unilateral forgiveness by the administration of student loans. I'm not saying whether it should be done. I'm saying the way it's being approached is unconstitutional and therefore illegal. The use of National Guard for domestic policy needs. New examples are appearing almost daily. We used to represent this encroachment with this two-dimensional representation of personal and economic liberty versus at the bottom economic and personal security. These developments are changing how we think about ourselves, our ambitions, and our goals. Charles Hugh Smith and I recently put out a video entitled Today's Self-Reliance that begins to delve into this subject. We followed it up with a second entitled Self-Reliance and the Importance of Protecting Choice. All can be found on the Matasi website. We're working on the next one entitled How Inflation Becomes Restrictive to Self-Reliance, or the Collapse of the American Dream, Financial Nihilism, and Inflation. This series is aimed at exploring how we are unwittingly surrendering our freedoms that make us who we want to be to ever-expanding central control. There are a lot of conclusions that can be distilled from these slides, which I encourage you to carefully think about. A number of them I will be discussing in upcoming newsletters. However, at this time, I want to highlight what I truly believe to be paramount and resonate with me personally. They may sound like platitudes, but never have they been more important than they are right now. If we don't focus on the importance of them and protect them, all the others will only be that much worse. What made America great was the self-reliance and independence of its people. Without it, innovation, capitalism, and risk-taking will disappear. It must be embraced and protected at all costs. It is currently under attack. The founders intended a limited federal government with the power at the state and local levels. They envisaged a distributed network, not a centralized one. Power was to rest with we the people, not a central state. The government works for the people, not the people doing what the government mandates. We are currently a country of laws. The law is not a political weapon. It is for the protection of the individual, not to potentially enslave them. Debt is the easiest way to enslave people. Debt created by the federal government is financial enslavement. But not to leave you hanging here. Here are some of the things I'll be talking about in coming newsletters that I got from this research. Our current path is unsustainable, and it will end with a global debt crisis. Growth is debt based in paper claims on real wealth. Wealth, however, is real, unencumbered, titled collateral. Debt will increasingly be harder to get because of collateral shortages. We have a major risk exposure with issues of rehypothecation, collateral transformations, and encumbered collateral. The crisis will occur when debt growth no longer produces growth. Globally, it has already eroded to $1 debt for $1 of growth. We saw that right at the beginning globally. In the U.S., it takes now as much as $2.50 of new debt to produce only $1 of growth. In the U.S., it takes as much as $1.50 of deficit growth to produce the $1 of growth. Remember, velocity of money must be sustainably larger than money supply, or GDP shrinks. That's not happening. The crisis will be the implosion of the derivative security complex, an unprecedented supercycle degree collapse. Collateral underpins all derivatives. Collateral will be swept up on a vast scale. The Great Reset, which you've heard about many times, is in the process of evolving. Government treasuries will soon begin the usage of contingent liability guarantees in our assessment. The Great Taking, which is a collateral confiscation scheme, will be executed. It is already in place and ready to be launched. It involves terminologies such as security entitlement and the protected class, dematerialization, security class, and safe harbor global provisions. These are words that within the next 3 to 5 years you're going to become well aware of. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take that money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as the comments often are, there has seldom actually been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed professional financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2024 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I sincerely thank you for listening.